All right. So I'm Jenny Syed. This is Kevin. We'll do more introductions here in a second. We're going to be talking about building on Cerner with SMART on FHIR and basically what it takes and what's the process to integrate applications with our system. So I'm Jenny Syed. I am a principal engineer at Cerner. If you're wondering why this is, if you read my speaker bio, I play a lot of video games. So in my free time. And I've worked at Cerner for about 17 years now. On GitHub, there's my call, or my username. I've worked with our FHIR server, so I'm the principal engineer specifically for our FHIR server. And then I also, throughout my history at Cerner, have done a lot with our RESTful web services and our open APIs.
And hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Shekleton. I've been at Cerner for 16 years now. I work in several different areas, but for those of you in the audience today, all you care about is that I work on SMART on FHIR at Cerner, as well as our CDS hook support, though I do have some other responsibilities. And like Jenny, I've worked on a bunch of different things at Cerner. Interesting fun fact, I started on the same team as Jenny when I started 16 years ago, and we kind of went our separate ways, and then now we found our paths back to each other working on interoperability.
Nice. Okay, so just a quick splash screen for Cerner. We have like 26,000, I can't talk, associates, about 27,000 provider facilities in more than 35 countries, and a lot of users. I'm not going to go through every single one of these stats, but if you want a little bit more information about all the different physician practices and how far the reach is for the systems that you can integrate with today. So one of our founders, Neil, always said that healthcare platforms need to be open. And that is what will allow healthcare to start innovating more and more. And we believe that this is very important in order to transform healthcare, because having that ecosystem around a platform and around healthcare is what's important and is what is going to advance the healthcare industry. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is our Cerner Ignite APIs for Millennium. It's our name for our implementations of SMART and FHIR on top of our Millennium platform. So we do have several different platforms at Cerner, but what we are talking about today is specifically limited to Millennium itself. And it allows patients and providers to integrate with our Millennium platform via both mobility solutions or desktop. There's not really a limitation there, which if you were here before, a lot of that's because of the way the SMART standard was built and the FHIR standard. So our Ignite APIs are cloud-based, and that gives us a lot of benefits. For developers, one of the biggest benefits you get is that we manage everything centrally. So if you're familiar with trying to integrate with EHR systems, a lot of times you have to worry about what version that system's on, what stuff is being exposed, how many patches they've taken, what they haven't taken, how that's going to affect your system. One of the benefits of FHIR being, our FHIR implementation being hosted in the cloud, is that no matter what system you go to, it is the same. So the only exception to that would be if they literally don't have that data, you can try to get it, but it's not going to return you the data. It's not going to error, though. It'll just say that there isn't data present. This also allows us to roll out changes very quickly. So we deploy right now weekly on our FHIR deployment, and we add corrections and enhancements whenever we need to. It also allows us to manage some of the terminology mapping centrally, so that we have a central team that's familiar with how we map our internal codes to the standards, and they do that at each site. It also allows us to hopefully make it easier for you to deploy your application at different sites, because we become familiar with your application and know what to map when we need to map it to bring your lab live. So where do you start if you're going to integrate? This is our Cerner Open Developer Experience. We call it CODE. We're healthcare and computers, so we like acronyms. So this is the website that you would start at, code.cerner.com. And it gives you a lot of places to explore, including some FAQs about what the process is, which we will talk a little bit about today, to integrate applications with our system, as well as links to all of our documentation, support, and terms of service are on there as well. So our developer ecosystem. At a high level, we support, I guess, application development from both a just third-party developer perspective as well as our clients. And those processes are a little bit different between those two views. So for example, when a client decides to develop apps against our Ignite APIs, we don't validate anything. We assume they're going to write it, be safe, the way they want it to integrate in their system. However, if they wanted to buy another application to integrate in their system, we do require developers, once they are ready, to come through us and go through validation, and that is specifically for provider-facing apps. Patient-facing apps are not the same. They don't go through this validation process with us. They're not required to. And I will talk about some of what we do during that validation, but that validation is a prerequisite before it's in our app gallery that a client can go and pull that application down and try to get it installed, or not really pull it down, but can purchase it and get it installed. And to dig a little bit in on this slide. So what does the progression look like? Our sandbox that's part of our ecosystem is open. You don't need to have any contractual relationship with us. You don't need to call us and ask for permission or anything like that. It's out there. It's on the internet. All of the documentation is free to use. The sandbox is free to use. And we have a Google group that is open that we get questions on all the time and we answer. So the first step is always to integrate in the sandbox. And we get a lot of questions about, well, is this going to be in production? Yes. What you see in our sandbox is a superset of what's in production, and we typically call out if something's in beta. So there will always be possibly a little bit more functionality in sandbox than in prod, but there won't ever be something in prod that's not in sandbox, if that makes sense. An example of that is we have system-to-system kind of in beta in our sandbox right now, so that we can figure out what people's questions are and stuff around that before we move it out. So once you've done that, open connections, which is an insecure connection, no requirement for authorization at that point, then you can do the next step, which is start using SMART and OAuth 2 to actually authenticate your application and go through the full workflow that you would see typically in production. Make sure that your application is still working, running, using the FHIR resources, has enough information, we expose enough information. And then you ask us to join our code developer experience. And that usually involves either having somebody that's ready to take your application or you have a target. There's just an application you fill out. You say, this is my application, this is my business. Yes, I've integrated it in Sandbox today, it works. And then there's a business process that takes over after that, which kicks off the validation that we're talking. And I will go more into validation. But once the validation is done, we help you provision into a non-production domain, so it can be validated, for example, by the client. And then once that's done, we help you provision into a production domain and get the application set up there. And it sounds like a lot of work, but it's usually, once you're in one site, it's not hard to move it to another site. So the app validation, some of the things that we look at when we are doing app validation is the security. We do a security review, which is one of the things we get a lot of questions about. We can go into some details about that here. We do a UX review to make sure that it kind of meets the experience expectations of providers and what they're used to in our system. And that doesn't mean it looks exactly like our system. That's not the point. It's more that there's not something in there that would be very surprising to them, that wouldn't be something that would be normal. We also want to make sure that it's safe and clear. So, for example, we want to make sure that if you're being launched in a specific patient's chart, you're not showing other patients' data, because that would be surprising and unclear to a physician and may cause a safety issue. We also do an operational and technical review, the goal being that if there's an issue, we know how to contact you, the clients know how to contact you, we know when support's available, we know where issues are logged, pretty much everything that we would get asked by a client on purchasing it to make sure that they can actually support the application. And then we do a functional review, especially with the specifics of the API, making sure that you're not making calls that are too costly and don't make sense for your workflow. So for example, you're not asking for every single observation, even though you only care about height. That would take a very long time for your application to do, and probably is not something you would want to wait on. And then also, we just kind of look at the way you use the API given the workflow and make sure it makes sense. Just at a quick glance, these are some of the apps we already have integrated today that are part of our developer program. And this includes, I believe, the ones as it talks about, there's a prospect where you guys ask us to include, to be part of the developer program. We make sure that the application makes sense and will provide value. And then they start the contracting process and all of the legal stuff that I don't have to deal with. And then it becomes part of the program. And at that point, you're able to go to site, and we'll put you in the app gallery so clients can see you. So an example of the app gallery. As I mentioned, before you can get into the app gallery, you do have to go through validation. So we do not list currently any of the patient applications at this point because part of the regulation from ONC was that we can't put through any kind of process that would be data blocking. Patients have rights to their data. So right now that validation process doesn't go through for patients and they're not listed yet. All right, so the guts of everything. How do you actually do stuff? Our developer documentation, which is linked from that code site, is FHIR.cerner.com. And it has, as you can see on the bottom there, and I will do a quick tour real quick, a live tour really quick, but it lists the Get Started, which actually links out to the HL7 site, to some of the overviews, which if you aren't familiar with those and you haven't worked with FHIR, I would recommend starting there. They have developer, executive, clinician overviews that kind of explain FHIR, and they give a great high-level intro. We've got links to some of our libraries, some of our FAQs, and then again, that support link goes out to our Google group so you can ask questions. And then the actual documentation itself lists all of the resources we support, all of the operations and like create, update that we support on those, as well as parameters. So to give you an example. Okay. So this is actually on our site, and we need to update that. I'm going to go to Millennium, because that's the one we're talking about today. As you can see, we list out every single resource we support. If you're wondering where these categories come from, they actually come from the standard itself. So the way that they're grouped on the standard is the way we have it grouped here. If I want to pick one of these, well, actually first, this overview page talks through how to start. So one of the biggest questions we get is, where is your sandbox? So this gives you the URL of both our open and our secure sandbox. It talks through just some basic overviews, including there's common issues in this page as well. There's examples of conformance. It talks about common errors we'll have, and it even talks about some of the security features we have with authorization, what we support, and cores, which is very important if you're doing a JavaScript application. So if I click on one of our resources, the types of things that you're going to see in here is categorized by the method that is done. So search, retrieve ID, create. And then within each of those, you should have, so for search, we document which parameters, because obviously the spec defines a lot of parameters, but we only support a subset of that. And so it calls out those types of limitations, as well as example requests and responses. These requests, you can actually copy the URLs out or the data out, and you should be able to run it live against our sandbox if you want to see it in action. So they're not made up. They're something you can recreate on your own. And then it also talks about any errors or any gotchas that are in here. So for example, I don't know if there's any on this one. Yeah, allergies is probably not. But it also talks about the terminology bindings. As you know, FHIR doesn't require a lot of value sets, and so we call out which ones we support, and we'll return on certain services. Okay, I'm going to have you switch back. All right, cool. So one of the things that we get questions about, again, as I mentioned, is the security. We have an FAQ on here that goes over a lot of the common issues that we have, as well as some of the common questions, especially with security. So to give some examples of things to watch out, and this would be true, it's not just our FHIR server, but these are issues I've seen repeated on many open FHIR servers and many FHIR systems or FHIR servers out there. Making sure that you're querying for data in an efficient manner, which we kind of talked about already. If you literally only need one code and you can query for that, query by it. Look for height, look for vitals. If you only care about labs, use the category of labs. There is a lot of data that comes in on a patient if they're in the hospital or if they're sick, and you don't want to make somebody wait a second for data when really it could have taken a really short amount of time to get there. Another one we see very commonly is that FHIR supports paging. Our services support paging, where we think that it's necessary, and a lot of times we'll see applications not check to see that there's a next page, and they'll just show that first page of data, which again can be a safety issue. So making sure that you are checking for paging and then checking for the next pages and reading them as needed, or indicating to the user that there's a next page to go to depending on what your workflow is. Another very common one we see is using appropriate scopes, both for the smart launch, so indicating, for example, what Josh and Dan were talking about in the last session, that you want a launch parameter to say that you are trying to trigger a smart launch, or that you're wanting a patient/launch, which is slightly different, so understanding those parameters, as well as the actual specific scopes. Why the specific scopes are important is if you've ever gotten an application that you've installed on Android, for example, or iOS, and it says it's just a picture app, and suddenly it's asking you for your permissions for your phone and your text messages and your location, you start to hesitate, right? Patients are also going to get that alert, and if your application is asking for permissions and they're, for example, installing something that's supposed to track their weight, and you're asking for permissions for all their physician notes and lab results, they're going to wonder why, right? It's a hesitation that you don't want to make them have. Similarly, for providers, this is something that we catch in validation, because a security representative at a client site would want to know, well, I thought this application was only supposed to do this. Why does it need all of this access, right? And then I'm trying to see if there's another one. Oh, also specifically, there are things that call out, and this just to point them out on here. We call out some of the UX requirements and tricks that we found just by a lot of sites use things like Citrix, and there's some gotchas with Citrix and video and certain use cases. So there's also things like that we've seen in the wild, where there's either issues with integration or issues with session bleed on browsers. So this is a really good page to read over. All right, so saying that. Our supported FHIR resources, I won't go through everything. One thing I do want to call out is that there's sometimes a misconception that write is not supported with FHIR today in the wild, and it is. Our server, when we first released in 2014, actually went out the door with 3 writes. So as you can see, we've got allergies, conditions, med statement, and document reference were some of the original ones we went out. Patient now also has write. That's intended mostly for pre-registration, as well as appointments. We now do writes on appointments. And then I will turn it over to Kevin.
All right, let's see here. Let me adjust this. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, Jenny did a great job giving an overview of our FHIR support, which is kind of one half of the SMART on FHIR support that we have at Cerner. Now I'm going to talk a bit about our smart app support. So we support integration with smart apps in a variety of different modalities today. So The first three on the list here are all within our PowerChart EHR. So PowerChart, if you're not familiar, is our EHR application. This is what doctors and nurses and clinicians use for care with a patient. And so we support smart applications in what we dub our organizer view. This is the view that when you sign into PowerChart, you don't have a patient's chart open initially. So you're signed in just as the user, and in PowerChart, we call that the organizer view. So you may have a patient list that you're looking at, or some other organizational level details, but nothing specific to an individual patient. So we do support smart apps that launch within that particular view. Now, any smart apps that do launch within that view are not going to have the context of the current patient because there is none. So instead, those smart applications should be used to look across to multiple patients, or even smart apps that don't even want to look at any patient data at all, which we do have those use cases, believe it or not. There are certain applications that don't need any EHR data, but they want to use SMART on FHIR to get a single sign-on experience so that they get launched within the workflow. The user doesn't have to authenticate again, and SMART provides value there for them. The second modality that we have is, again, within PowerChart, but this time within a patient's chart. So now you've signed into the EHR, and you've opened up a particular patient's chart. You can embed a SMART application within the workflow there. Smart apps that get launched within there can get access to the current patient's record. So they can be notified, hey, this patient is the one that we're currently viewing. Though you could actually also integrate smart applications that were cross-patient or didn't need a patient's any of that patient context, and you could still launch them in there, but that's certainly much less common there. The third is within PowerChart again, but within our MPage framework. So Cerner's MPage framework is our proprietary web-based application framework that resides within PowerChart. Many of our clients have begun or are transitioning to heavily using that MPage framework, which means that it's a different user experience within the chart, and all of the components and UX within that experience is all web-based, and clients are also able to develop their own MPage components. Well, we provide an MPage wrapper for your smart app so that you can take your smart app, which it's assumed, by the way, in these first three that I'm talking about here, that your smart app is all web-based. You can take your web-based smart app, and using an open source component that I'll talk about in a bit, you can make that web application, your web application, run inside of the MPage framework with no changes, really. You don't have to actually conform to anything proprietary. The fourth is within our Healthy Life patient portal. So Healthy Life is the name for Cerner's patient portal platform. Our clients often will rebrand this. So when we provide it to them, they white label it and they rebrand it according to their organization and their branding. But you're able to embed smart applications within the Healthy Life patient portal. And then finally, we allow for standalone web or mobile applications. So these could be, again, web application or even a native application, though I don't believe we have any native applications in production today. We do. We do have a native application in production today. Oh, yeah, one, of course. Yeah, I forgot. But for the standalone applications, you're not going to get a single sign-on experience like you would within these other ones because you're being launched outside of either the EHR or the patient portal. So in these cases, you're going to get prompted to authenticate again. So for instance, if you have an iPhone and you've hooked up the health app to your patient's portal like I have, I'll have to authenticate to my patient portal. So in my case, we have a Cerner clinic for associates like Jenny and I can pull up my data through the Cerner clinic's FHIR server, so I'm authenticating against with the Cerner clinic's credentials that I have, and then I can pull that down into the health app. So effectively, the health app is acting as a standalone smart application in this case, and that's the production application that I, of course, overlooked that I shouldn't have, because I use it. I wanted to show some metrics here. These are metrics that I actually pulled this morning for the last 30 days. This is from our production use. So we have 31 smart applications in production. Over the last 30 days, those apps have been launched over 87,000 times. Those apps collectively have made 1.2 FHIR calls. This is all in production. And there were 15,000 unique users using those applications, which is pretty cool. So this is the graph over the last month of those calls and those launches. So you can kind of see where the weekends are, since predominantly our usage is mainly on the provider face side today. But it's been interesting to see this grow over time. As Jenny mentioned, we first went to production at the end of 2014, at very limited use, obviously, but things have ramped up quite a bit since then. So this is definitely not something that is something that's like in our, in the lab, so to speak. Like this is real in production. There are companies that are have deployed their applications and are in heavy use at our client sites. Jenny mentioned this earlier, but I'll reiterate some of this and expand upon it, is that we have a public Google group for anyone who is doing development on top of our FHIR APIs or writing smart applications against ours. You don't have to be in the code program to join or view this Google group. This Google group is linked from FHIR.Cerner.com. It probably is also linked from code.cerner.com. But if you search for Cerner FHIR developers, you'll find this group. The entire Ignite API team within Cerner is monitoring this group. You'll see Jenny, I think, wins the record on the team for the most responses to developers. We probably get around 10 to 15 messages a day on this Google group. We have 750 people registered who are actually following the activity of the group, and more that are just anonymously browsing it. So I'd encourage you guys to check this out. We've got frequently asked questions also on this group, as well as like sample patients that are in our sandbox. And like I said, every day we get all sorts of questions where people are asking us how do things work, and just general questions, and we're very transparent and open on this group. And so I'd encourage you guys to all check it out. And again, you don't have to be part of the code program or go through that whole validation process. All of you can just join this today, or at least browse this. At Cerner, we love open source. We're big consumers of open source software, which is no surprise. I'm sure many of you also are consumers of open source software. But we also contribute quite a bit of open source software back to the community. We have a GitHub organization that is just called Cerner. So if you go to github.com/Cerner, you will see the 50 or 60 repositories that we have. That's a growing list every day. Specifically to interoperability, I'm going to touch on some that are of interest to this group within here. And then I'll also give a kind of advertisement for later on this week. A colleague of ours, Ryan Brush, is going to be speaking on Thursday about an open source project called Bunsen. So if you're working with FHIR and big data, I'd encourage you to attend Ryan's talk on Thursday. All of that work is also open source as well, and Ryan will be talking about that in more detail. All of our open source code is all Apache version 2 licensed, which if you're not familiar with that license, it means that basically you can take that code and you can do whatever you want with it. You could actually even take that code, repackage it up as your own, and sell it if you wanted to. It's a very, very permissive license, and we thought that was important to release our code in that manner so that people weren't afraid of using it. So one of the first projects that I want to talk about is the ASCVD Risk Calculator Smart App. This is actually a full production quality smart application that we developed at Cerner in conjunction with Duke University. And what's interesting about this is that Duke University is actually not a Cerner client. So we at Cerner had started down the path of working with another open source smart app that was a risk calculator smart app that was based upon the Reynolds risk score. We quickly realized that that app was not as clinically relevant to cardiologists. And then we started talking with a cardiologist, or a few cardiologists at Duke. And we decided that we'd collaborate together with them to build out this smart app. So we wanted to build something that was a production level smart app, so something built to how we build our applications at Cerner. So that means an application that has full unit testing from the start, that goes through a full UX design with Cerner UX designers, that is supported. So Cerner supports this application for our clients. We wanted the application to be responsive and accessible, so have a responsive and accessible design. And we open source all this work. So this application actually is provided for free for all Cerner clients. We host and support that. And I was just talking with the folks at Duke University actually this week, and they're getting this application set up in their environment, which is pretty exciting. You can view the application in the Smart App Gallery that Josh and Dan talked about in the previous presentations. That's listed there, and it's also in Cerner's GitHub organization, so all the sources available there. You can run this application today, and like I said, this is running in production today at Cerner sites. And also, I should mention that this is a great example if you want a fully fledged smart application to see, like, smart application, built completely, not just like a toy project. This is probably your best bet to start with if you're wanting to look for a full-fledged smart application to see, what would one look like. We've got a couple NPM packages that are useful for smart app developers. One of which is useful to all smart app developers. The other one is only for smart app developers who want to run your applications inside of Cerner's EHR. So the first here, the Cerner Smart Embeddable Library, this one is, remember I mentioned how one of the modalities that you can run your smart application in is as an M-page component. Well, this library, if you drop that into your project, it allows your project to seamlessly run as an M-page component. So you just drop this in, and that's enough right there for your application to get framed within an M-page container, and that's all you need. The second one, this FHIR Client Cerner Editions, this one is actually critical if your application is a JavaScript application, so you're doing FHIR calls within the browser, and your application is going to be embedded in a native IE browser within a native Windows application. So Cerner's EHR Power Chart, the web browser that's running is an embedded IE browser. And I know other EHR vendors have confirmed with them that they also have similar embedded IE browsers. Well, when you set up that IE browser, if you don't do it in a particular multi-threaded fashion, then the session store within the browser is actually shared between all instances of that IE browser, which means that, like in the case of Power Chart, if you have multiple patients' charts are open, you don't have a session store that's unique per patient chart, like you would in a normal browser where every tab has its own session store. Instead, it's a shared session store. And the way the FHIRclient.js library works, which is an open source library that many web application developers use, that is maintained by the Smart Health IT group, that library relies upon the session store for storing your OAuth token. And so when you don't have that Sandbox session store between the multiple patients' charts, what you end up with is the last patient chart you've opened is the last OAuth access token that exists in that session store. And so now all the FHIR calls that all the various instances of your application are making, now actually you're just getting the last patient's chart data, but within your application, it's being shown for those other patients. So it's a critical patient safety bug. And this library that we open sourced actually modifies that default behavior in the FHIRclient.js library to work around this particular bug. So if you're wanting to run within a Cerner environment, we actually make this a requirement. You need to, and your application is a JavaScript application where you're calling the FHIR APIs through your browser, you have to include this in your application. Now the good news is that this is not just for Cerner. There are other major EHR providers that have this same exact behavior within their native EHRs that we've confirmed with them. And so this would be something you'd want to include if you're running within those EHR vendors as well too. The other good news is by dropping this library in, it actually doesn't harm your application at all. So even if you weren't even running within a Cerner environment, you could still drop this in, and it just changes the behavior of the FHIR client JS library to kind of work around this issue. So it's something that you should really, really consider and required if you're going to work within Cerner's EHR. But we thought that everyone's going to find this useful, so we open sourced it and wanted to make it available to everybody. All right, almost done here. Jenny talked about our sandbox, our FHIR sandbox, which is completely open. We also have our code console, which is basically our SMART on FHIR sandbox. If you're in the previous presentation, Dan showed off the great Smart Health IT, Smart App Launcher, which gives you a bunch of different options and stuff for launching your smart application. We have an equivalent that allows you to launch your smart application against a mock Cerner EHR or a mock patient portal. So you can go and register your application, and Jenny briefly touched upon this, how it's completely free. You don't have to be part of the code program. So if you go to code.cerner.com, there's a link on there to go to the code console. You can register your application, say it's either a provider or a patient-facing application. You get to pick your scopes, register, and then you can launch and test out your application against our FHIR server. We actually have a hands-on tutorial that is available at this URL here, engineering.cerner.com/smartonfhir tutorial. This also is in our GitHub organization. We actually open source this tutorial as well. This open source tutorial walks you through creating your very first Smart on FHIR application. So it kind of gives you a starter app, walks you through all the pieces where you change the code, the values to put in. It walks you through registering that application in the code portal, as well as how to launch that application on the Smart Health IT launcher that Dan showed earlier. And you can take that same application, and this is the whole value proposition of Smart, and run that application against other EHR vendors' sandboxes as well to make sure that everything works in a completely interoperable fashion. And it does cover both provider and patient-facing smart apps. I should also note that the presentation as well as the link for this will be sent out to everyone at the end of the conference. So if you didn't get a picture of this or remember that URL, you'll be able to get it after the conference here. And with that, we're at the end of our presentations, and we have about 3 minutes left for any Q&A. Yeah, in the back there. So the question was, does the sandbox support the workflow FHIR resources that you learned about earlier? We don't yet have support for the workflow resources yet. So I'm going to repeat your question for everybody else, but also make sure that we understood it. So you asked, we talked about our cloud-hosted FHIR platform, and then I didn't hear the rest of that. Yeah, so the question was for our clients who are host the software themselves and they're not hosted by Cerner, what capabilities aren't available here? And
answer's really short. Yeah. It's the same capabilities. The FHIR server itself would still be in the cloud, but we connect down to your hosted services. Yeah, so this is going to get into the business side of things, and I know they've been switching this around. There is a license if you're going to do your own development on Ignite. There's a license for that, but you don't pay for anything for the extra connection or anything like that. It's treated the same as any other, like any of our hosted clients that we do.
Two questions. I noticed that Millennium supports DSD2 version 2. Any plans when it will be on version 3?
Okay, so the question was, he noticed that Millennium supports DSDU2, and when is it going to support STU3? I don't have any timeline that I can tell you for that specifically, but I can say that we are planning to support the newer versions of FHIR as well.
Second question, the IE bug that you were pointing out, is that only applicable to the JavaScript-based client? Or if there was a different framework like Java or .NET or Ruby, like would that?
It's basically, so the question was that JavaScript bug that I talked about, what does it affect exactly? If you're using the FHIR-client.js JavaScript library, then this bug will affect you. And more generally, if you have any code in your application that is storing data in the HTML5 session store, when you're developing in a normal browser, that session store is unique per tab in your browser. But in all the major HR vendors that I'm aware of, their embedded IE browser does not have that same sandboxing of the session data.
It's based on the session store. Like it's not something that affects like if the session was stored as a cookie.
No. It's literally the HTML5.
HTML5 session
Yeah.
store problem.
Yep. Last question.
For the people that host their own software, do you have a published list of their endpoints?
So the question was, for people who host their own software, do we have a published list of their own endpoints? This is something that Jenny touched upon that I probably didn't come across as we intended, but we host the FHIR endpoint in the cloud. So whether or not you're a hospital that hosts your own software or you're hosted by Cerner, we have a single cloud endpoint that's for all clients. So you have as a developer, you have a consistent endpoint and API. So you have the same version of FHIR, you have the same resources. When we add a new FHIR resource, or like Jenny said, make a bug fix or an enhancement, that actually is applied to all clients who have the FHIR API. The client doesn't have to take any packages, or we have to wait for that to happen. So as a developer, it's really easy for you. So with that, we're out of time, but Jenny and I will both be here all week, so we'll be happy to answer your questions out in the hallway or later this week. Thank you.